Welcome to Mr. Night Media.
Three friends, Rachel, Greg, and Olivia, set off on a road trip across the country, excited to escape the monotony of their everyday lives. They're heading to a remote cabin deep in the woods for a weekend of camping and disconnecting from technology. As they drive further from civilization, the GPS starts glitching, showing them strange and winding detours they didn't plan for. Eventually, they find themselves on an old, abandoned highway that doesn't appear on any maps. The air feels heavier here, the daylight dimmer, and the radio picks up nothing but static. The trio laughs it off at first, chalking it up to bad technology and a weird sense of isolation. But then they notice that every mile marker they pass shows the same number, 66. Greg jokes about the number, claiming it's just a coincidence, until they pass a figure on the side of the road. A woman in tattered clothes, her thumb out, asking for a ride. Olivia wants to stop, but Rachel feels a deep sense of unease, a gut instinct that something is off. They decide not to stop, but when they glance in the rearview mirror, the woman is standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at them, her eyes hollow and dark. They speed up, hearts pounding, but after a few more miles, they see the same woman ahead of them, standing exactly as before. Somehow, they're caught in a loop. Panicked, they decide to turn off the highway at the first chance they get, hoping to find some form of civilization. They come across an old gas station with flickering neon lights that seem half dead, a place that feels stuck in time. A lone, pale attendant with a blank stare stands behind the counter. His eyes don't blink as they ask him for directions. "We don't get many travelers down this way," he mutters, giving them vague directions to a motel that's supposedly nearby. When they leave the gas station, Rachel notices the attendant watching them, his figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror. As they drive away, the gas station suddenly vanishes as if it was never there at all. After hours of driving, they stumble upon the motel the attendant mentioned. It's dilapidated, the kind of place that looks abandoned, but a single room is lit. Desperate, they decide to stay the night. The woman at the front desk is as unsettling as the gas station attendant, expressionless, with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Their room is cold and damp, the wallpaper peeling, but they're too tired to care. As they settle in, the phone rings. Rachel answers, only to hear the faint sound of breathing on the other end. She slams the phone down, her heart racing. Later that night, Olivia wakes up to the sound of scratching from behind the walls, like something or someone is trapped inside. Greg reassures her that it's just rats, but the scratching grows louder and more desperate, echoing through the hollow motel. The door to their room slowly creaks open on its own, and in the dim hallway, the trio sees the figure of the same woman from the highway, her head tilting unnaturally as she stares at them. Terrified, they flee the motel, only to find themselves back on Highway 66. No matter which direction they take, they can't escape. Every sign, every landmark is the same, as though they're driving in circles. The phantom woman appears on the side of the road over and over, closer each time, her grin growing wider. Desperation sets in as they try to make sense of what's happening. They realize they've been on the road for days without sleep, food, or any sense of time passing. Greg starts to unravel, hearing voices whispering his name from the static on the radio. Olivia sees shadows moving just out of sight, her paranoia growing with each passing hour. In a moment of madness, Rachel grabs the steering wheel and veers off the road, crashing into a ditch. When they come to, the car is wrecked, and they're stranded in the middle of nowhere. Rachel looks at the GPS one last time. It's stuck at 66, flashing ominously. As they stumble out of the car, they realize they're not alone. The woman from the highway is standing just a few feet away, her eyes now black voids, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Behind her, more figures emerge from the trees, silent, pale, and soulless. They're trapped in this loop forever, a curse with no beginning and no end. The highway will never let them go. Max, Sarah, and Kyle are lifelong friends planning a spontaneous road trip to a music festival in the desert. They pack up Max's beat-up station wagon, fueled by excitement and a little bit of recklessness. The GPS routes them through the main highway, but halfway into their drive, Sarah notices a notification. A faster route through a rural back road that saves them 2 hours. Against Kyle's better judgment, Max takes the detour. As they drive deeper into the wilderness, the road narrows, the pavement cracking and overgrown with weeds. Trees become dense, their twisted branches casting ominous shadows over the car. The sun dips low, and before long, they're swallowed by the night. Suddenly, a deer darts in front of the car. Max swerves, barely missing it, but the car stalls. The headlights flicker, and the engine sputters to a halt. Kyle gets out to inspect the damage. "It'll be fine," he mutters. But when he looks under the hood, the engine's covered in a thick black substance, something sticky and unnatural. Max tries to call for help, but there's no signal. Sarah, already anxious, swears she saw something moving among the trees. A figure, just beyond the reach of the car's flickering headlights. Max brushes it off as nerves, telling her they'll figure it out in the morning. They decide to sleep in the car for the night, thinking they can deal with the problem at first light. But sleep doesn't come easily. In the silence of the night, strange sounds echo through the woods. Footsteps crunch on fallen leaves, too heavy to be animals. Sarah hears whispering, soft, unintelligible voices like a distant conversation. Just as they're drifting off, there's a loud bang on the car roof. They wake in a panic, hearts racing. Max grabs a flashlight, stepping outside cautiously. Nothing's there. As he shines the light into the forest, something darts between the trees, too fast for him to see clearly, but large enough to leave them all terrified. Morning comes, and with it, a sinking realization. The road they came in on is gone. In its place is an endless stretch of forest, the car seemingly stranded in the middle of nowhere. No landmarks, no tire tracks, just an unending sea of trees. Panic sets in. Kyle suggests they walk, but Max insists on trying to fix the car. Hours pass with no success, and Sarah grows increasingly paranoid, claiming to see more figures moving through the forest. When night falls again, the situation worsens. The whispering returns, louder now, accompanied by faint laughter, cold and sinister. The air feels thick, heavy with something unexplainable. Suddenly, the radio in the car turns on by itself, playing an old, crackling tune from the 1950s. The dials move on their own, switching between static and broken, eerie music. As Max frantically tries to turn off the radio, Sarah lets out a blood-curdling scream. She points toward the forest edge, where shadowy figures stand just out of reach of the headlights, watching them. Dozens of them, tall, thin, and featureless, each one swaying gently as though blown by an unseen wind. Kyle, now trembling, grabs a wrench from the back of the car and steps forward, trying to seem brave. "We need to get out of here," he shouts, but Max is frozen in fear. The figures don't move, but they're getting closer, just standing there, their presence suffocating. Suddenly, the car's lights cut out. They're plunged into darkness. The air fills with the sound of running feet, whispers growing to a deafening chorus. The figures rush the car, their footsteps pounding the ground in unison. Max slams the car door shut, just as something crashes into the side of the vehicle. Sarah screams, and the car shakes violently as the figures circle them, hitting the windows and doors. In a moment of sheer desperation, Max finally manages to start the car. Without thinking, he slams on the gas, swerving through the forest, avoiding the trees. The shadowy figures chase them, but the car speeds out of reach. After what feels like an eternity, they burst through the tree line and onto a road, one that looks strangely familiar. Relieved, they speed down the road, away from the nightmare. But their relief is short-lived. Kyle, pale and shaking, notices something out of the window. "We've been here before." Max slams on the brakes. The road sign they passed an hour ago is right in front of them again, and the gas station they stopped at earlier in the day stands just ahead, boarded up and dilapidated, despite having been fully operational when they arrived. They're back where they started. And worse, the car's headlights flicker once again as the black substance starts dripping from the engine. The figures are nowhere to be seen, but the whispering returns. As the sun sets, they know the cycle has begun again. No matter how far they drive, they always return to this point. a loop they cannot break. Exhausted, hopeless, they accept their fate. The car sputters to a stop for the last time. This time, when the figures emerge from the woods, there's no running. The headlights die, and they're left in pitch-black darkness, the cold, hollow laughter of the unseen beings echoing around them. The whispers close in, and the figures take them, one by one. The car is found weeks later, empty, with no trace of the three friends. The only thing out of place? A thick, black substance smeared across the inside of the windshield. Three friends, Emily, Jake, and Claire, were on a long-awaited road trip. They had planned the perfect vacation, driving through the scenic back roads of the Midwest, exploring old towns, and camping along the way. Jake was behind the wheel of his father's old station wagon, music blasting, windows down. They were on the road for hours, laughing and feeling free. Then the GPS went dead. "No big deal," Jake said. "We'll just follow this road." But the road stretched on, endless, without any signs or turns. The sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, and a strange fog was settling in, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. After what felt like hours, they finally spotted something ahead. A gas station. It looked ancient, run down, with flickering lights. Jake pulled in, relieved to find somewhere they could ask for directions. Emily and Claire stayed in the car while Jake went inside. The gas station attendant was an old man with deep-set, hollow eyes. He stared at Jake without blinking. "We're lost. Can you tell us where this road leads?" Jake asked. The old man didn't answer. Instead, he pushed a map across the counter. "This is the only road. Follow it all the way." "What do you mean, the only road? Where does it go?" The old man just smiled, his teeth blackened and rotten. "You'll see soon enough." Jake, uneasy, hurried back to the car. "Let's just get the hell out of here." As they drove off, Emily looked back and gasped. "Jake, that gas station, it's gone." Jake glanced in the rearview mirror. She was right. There was nothing behind them. No gas station, no lights, just the dark, empty road. Hours passed. The fog thickened, and their anxiety grew. They hadn't seen another car, house, or person since the gas station. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, with no sign of civilization. The fuel gauge was inching toward empty. Then, out of nowhere, Claire spotted something on the side of the road, a hitchhiker. He was standing perfectly still, his face obscured by the fog, his thumb outstretched. Jake sped past him, but a mile down the road they saw him again. The same man, the same eerie stillness. "What the hell is going on?" Emily whispered. They passed the hitchhiker a third time. This time, Claire swore his head turned to follow them as they passed. "Stop the car!" she screamed. But Jake kept driving, the panic rising inside him. The road was warping in front of their eyes, curving impossibly, winding back on itself, yet always stretching straight ahead. They were driving in a loop, but the road never changed. The radio, which had been silent, suddenly crackled to life. Static filled the car, then a voice broke through. At first it was faint, garbled, but then it became clear. "Turn back!" They all froze. Jake fiddled with the radio, but the voice kept coming through, louder and more insistent. Turn back before it's too late." Jake slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the fog-shrouded road. "What the hell is going on?" he yelled. Suddenly the engine died, and everything went silent. The fog pressed in on all sides, thick and suffocating. The road was no longer visible, swallowed by the mist. Then they heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing closer. From the fog, a figure emerged. It was the hitchhiker again, but this time he was standing in the middle of the road, just a few feet from the car. His face, blank, featureless, stared directly at them, though he had no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin. Emily screamed. Jake tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The figure moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate. His head tilted unnaturally to the side as if studying them, even without a face. "Lock the doors!" Claire cried, but when they reached for the locks, the doors clicked open on their own. The faceless man reached the driver's side window and slowly raised his hand. He placed it against the glass. The fog seemed to pulse around him, alive and breathing. Suddenly, the car jerked backward as if something had grabbed it from behind. The force pulled them down the road, away from the faceless man. Jake, Emily, and Claire screamed as the car sped in reverse, tires squealing. but no one was driving it. Then just as abruptly the car stopped. Silence. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a massive old wooden sign ahead. It read, "Welcome to Dead End." The road had changed. Now it looked ancient, overgrown with vines crumbling at the edges. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. "There's no way this was here before," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. Jake, against his better judgment, turned the key. The engine roared to life. They drove forward, but the road was no longer endless. Instead, it led them straight into a town, if you could call it that. The buildings were crooked, decaying as if they hadn't been touched in centuries. No lights, no people, just emptiness. At the center of the town was an old church, its doors hanging open, creaking in the wind. A single bell tolled from its tower, though no one was there to ring it. Inside the church, they found rows of old, rotting pews. On the altar, there were dozens of photographs, pictures of people standing in front of the gas station they had stopped at. Some were recent, others from decades past. In every single picture, the hitchhiker stood in the background, faceless, always watching. Then they saw it, their own picture, taken just hours before, outside the gas station that had vanished. The three of them, with the faceless man looming behind. Suddenly, the door to the church slammed shut. They turned to run, but the faceless man was there, blocking their exit. This time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of others just like him emerged from the shadows surrounding them. As the figures closed in, the last thing they heard was the tolling of the bell. The road outside the town disappeared, swallowed by the fog. Their car was never found, and neither were they. After the church doors slammed shut, the darkness felt like it was closing in on Emily, Jake, and Claire. The faceless figures surrounded them, their blank expressions somehow more terrifying than anything they had ever seen. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as the sound of the tolling bell echoed endlessly in the distance. But then everything went completely still. The figures stopped moving, standing frozen like statues. The air shifted, cold and sharp, as if something far worse was about to happen. Jake, his heart pounding in his chest, grabbed Claire's hand. "We need to get out of here now." Emily took a step back, but when her heel touched the floor, it wasn't the worn wood of the church anymore. She looked down to see that the ground had turned to dirt. Wet, sticky dirt. "No, no, no, no," Claire whispered. The room was transforming, melting into something else. The walls of the church stretched upward, twisting into grotesque, contorted shapes, the windows warping and darkening until they disappeared. They were no longer in a church, but in some kind of underground cavern, deep and oppressive. The smell of damp earth and rot filled their nostrils, and the floor beneath them began to sink, pulling them down into the muck. "We have to move," Jake shouted, but before he could lead them anywhere, a deep, guttural voice filled the cavern. "You can't leave now, you belong here." Emily froze. That voice, it wasn't human. It reverberated through the very air, vibrating their bones. She turned to see the faceless man standing directly in front of her. This time his face wasn't blank. Instead, it was hers. Her own reflection, distorted and twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The faceless figures began to change, each one morphing into a different version of Jake, Claire, and Emily. Grotesque doppelgangers, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. "We're trapped," Claire whispered. "There's no way out." Suddenly, the ground gave way entirely. They were falling, tumbling into a black void, no sense of direction, no sense of time. Emily tried to scream, but the air was pulled from her lungs. Then, without warning, they hit the ground, hard. The pain shot through their bodies, but when they looked around, they weren't in the cavern anymore. They were standing in front of the gas station again, the same one they had stopped at before. It was morning, the fog gone, the sun just beginning to rise. For a brief moment, relief washed over them. "Are we back?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. But something was wrong. The air felt wrong. The gas station was exactly as it had been before, but there was no sound, no birds, no cars, no wind. The world was eerily still. "I think we never left," Emily said softly. They approached the gas station door, and just like before, the old man was behind the counter. But this time, he didn't look up. He was staring at something behind them. They turned slowly. There, at the edge of the road, the hitchhiker stood again, his faceless head tilted just slightly. But now, there was something different. Behind him, far in the distance, the figures from the cavern were walking toward them, slowly, deliberately. Jake, Emily, and Claire froze, realization dawning. They were still trapped in the loop. No matter how far they drove, no matter what they did, the road would always lead them back here. The figures would always find them. And every time, they would lose a little more of themselves, becoming like the faceless ones who had trapped them there. The old man at the counter finally spoke, his voice a rasping whisper. "There's no leaving dead end. You've been claimed."